Hello and welcome to the podcast Shedding Candlelight on Cryptids, Hauntings, Mythology, and more. If it is weird, we are talking about it. This is your host, Lee Donna, and today I am bringing you all of the delicious bits of horror that surround the Bloody Lady of Čachtický. Some of the hype is most certainly real, while other tantalizing bites are a little hard to chew. So hold on to your dinner plates and prepare your appetite for the indulgence that is Countess Elizabeth Bathory.
Immortal sunshine.
Last month, in February of 2025, I released part one of Elizabeth's story. That episode contained most of the necessary historical context that is needed to fully understand the saga. So if you have not listened to part one, I highly recommend that you pause this episode and go listen to that one first. Part one places Elizabeth on our human timeline, gives information about what was happening in her part of the world during that time, and most importantly, gives you the background on how Elizabeth came to be. I went over her very royal lineage, her family's generational wealth, portions of their land holdings, and her connections to the aristocracy and the ruling classes, which all speaks to the value of her name, which is what she is cashing in on right now, where our story is going to begin today. The year is 1609. Elizabeth has been a widow for about 7 years now. And because of war, disease, the death of her husband and eldest brother, the income Elizabeth is accustomed to just is not there. At this point in history, she is the overseer and caretaker of 17 villages and one castle estate that she alone owns. Elizabeth is also still managing her husband's estates that now belong to her son, who is still too young to be the overseer of his own lands. The noble family in charge has many responsibilities when it comes to being the overseer, and I covered all of those duties in the last episode. What's important now is that even though Elizabeth's villages are producing goods to sell, the market they have to sell to is growing ever smaller, not only in Hungary, but on a world stage as the wars and outbreaks of disease plaguing Hungary sets the country up to economically fall behind the rest of Europe. I think it's fair to say that the monarchy ruling Hungary, the Habsburgs, were giving their country a bad name. With all the wars and rebellions breaking out inside their own borders, to make matters worse, they even brought in a bunch of German mercenaries to fight for them because Royal Hungary just simply did not have a force large enough to stand against the forces of Central Hungary, which was controlled by the Ottomans. Those German soldiers were given precedence over even the native born Hungarian soldiers, and the people of Hungary were not even allowed to sell goods to the Germans. Those mercenaries were getting supplies, but inside of Hungary, they were not paying for anything. They were allowed to take whatever they wanted. And if the people spoke out about how they were being treated, those people were the ones who would get punished, not the soldiers. So you can see how the Hungarian people were suffering on many fronts. And also, the Habsburg monarchy was suffering because they financially had to borrow money from Elizabeth and her husband Francis before he died, just to be able to pay for those German reinforcements. This loan became an issue for Francis, the Black Bey of Hungary. He wanted the loan repaid before his death, When that didn't happen, his widow took up the cause, asking the monarchy to repay the money that was owed. However, the Habsburgs did not comply, and thus Elizabeth was left with what little money could be made off of her villages. She no longer had the extreme amount of money her husband was making off of the war, nor did she have access to her birth family's coffers because her brother, the heir, died without an heir of his own. So the vast majority of that wealth transferred to her brother's ward, Gabriel Bathory, a man of legend, said to be so strong that he could break horseshoes in half with his bare hands. Gabriel was now one of the largest landowners in all of royal Hungary, which also made him one of the wealthiest. With her bank accounts running low, Elizabeth has to find another means of supporting herself, her household, her extensive medical staff, and the people of her 17 villages. So she uses the only other thing of real value that she has, her name. Elizabeth Bathory opens a finishing school. For a meager little fee, young ladies could move into her castle and learn all the rules of etiquette from the Countess herself. The widow who wore red to the royal palace in Versailles only one short month after her husband's death. The clothing choice was a big faux pas, according to the other high-born royals. But their tongue wagging never stopped Elizabeth from doing much of anything, nor did those dark whispers floating through Hungary about the witch in Elizabeth's court. Bathory wasn't even bothered by the priest who basically followed her to court after her husband's death, telling everyone who would listen about the black magic the Countess was practicing. Hungarians apparently did not like Croatians any more than they liked Slovakians. It was a whole thing, and Elizabeth did not care. She was like, hey, I just want the best person for the job. And the priest was like, yeah, but did you guys hear the part about the Croatian midwife she has working for her? A Croatian. You heard me. A devil. And she's a woman. It was blasphemous because typically only men did the midwifing at that point, and they exclusively did the surgeries. So people were taken aback when Elizabeth bucked their traditions, and she did so quite often. She wasn't afraid to go against the grain, and this led to the smart, organized Elizabeth Bathory getting under some skin in more ways than one. By the time Elizabeth decides to open her school in 1609, there are already rumors being passed around in the villages, rumors of torture. Sadly, for the daughters of the lesser noble families, these rumors did not serve as a deterrent. The high up nobles were taking a hard pass on sending their daughters to Elizabeth's school, but those middle of the road nobles did not have a problem letting their daughters enter Elizabeth's castle. I'm sure these lesser nobles thought that their daughters finding favor with someone like Elizabeth would catapult them up the social ladder. Therefore, they either ignored the rumors or possibly never heard them. Elizabeth opened her boarding school doors, and in walked 8 bright eyed young noblewomen. 3 weeks later, in October of 1609, not a single one of those young women was still alive. There was sickness afoot, according to Elizabeth, and her entire first batch of students simply succumbed to an evil epidemic. Therefore, she couldn't possibly release those bodies back to the families. And honestly, that does make sense. You would assume that if the girls died because of an outbreak, people in 1609 Hungary, having dealt with so many outbreaks already, would have probably guessed that transporting bodies back and forth all over the country was a recipe for contamination. They didn't have vehicles like we have today, so transportation was slower, and these people lived far apart. Also, with 8 dead girls, Elizabeth probably couldn't afford to dispatch that many wagons all at once. She's on a budget now, guys. So I am not sure if she charged a lump sum fee for her school's tuition or if it was a payment plan situation. But either way, the money Elizabeth was expecting to make from the school was about to be buried, unlike some of her students. You see, while none of the bodies were released to the families, only some of these young ladies were buried in proper graveyards. The rest were just sort of thrown out into whatever place was convenient. This callous behavior in a time that not only saw epidemics breaking out, but in a time when superstitions were running amok about the dead coming back to life, if not at the very least, buried on holy ground. Only the very brave would dare to leave bodies strewn about on unholy ground. But Elizabeth was sort of the queen of bravery, and she has ties to the very place that we all know birthed vampires, Transylvania, the very place that her beloved royal Hungary and her husband's best friend George were very preoccupied with, which is why they could not be bothered to entertain all of these rumors of witchcraft and torture and murder. I mean, yeah, back then rumors were enough to get people in a lot of trouble. According to Hungary's laws, if everyone was talking about a certain something, then it was common knowledge. So all the authorities had to do was gather enough of this salacious, rumor filled common knowledge, and then they could charge someone with a crime. But King Matthias of Hungary and his right hand man, George Thurzo, the childhood best friend of Elizabeth's now dead hero of Hungary husband, had situations brewing in Transylvania that required their full attention. Also, the rumors said Elizabeth was using her black magic on servants, most of which were Slovakian and worse, female. So who cares? The men did not have time to deal with such nonsense. I mean, here's an example of the silly kinds of things people were complaining about. One time, Elizabeth caught a servant girl stealing coins. She ordered one of her other servants to heat those coins in the fireplace until they were red hot. And then she pressed the sizzling coins into the palm of the would be thief, marking the girl. So if the child was ever caught stealing again, she would face a much harsher punishment. Under the legal code of Hungary at the time, the punishment not only fit the crime, but so did pretty much anything else because the general rules were that anything was allowed, so long as it did not kill the servant or maim them in a way that would make it impossible for them to work again. So Elizabeth couldn't say, cut off both of the girl's hands, but physically and mentally scarring her for life and risking possible wound infections that would lead to her death. Yeah, that was all fine. And honestly, if the girl had tried to steal livestock, like a chicken or a horse, that was the kind of theft punishable by hanging. So I guess Elizabeth could be seen as being benevolent here. At the very least, we have to acknowledge that Elizabeth was well within her rights under Hungarian law. They had something considered a code of violence, and it is as wild as that name suggests. Plus, there was private violence where one could do much worse than what was allowed in public violence, because in public, you can only attack a person of the same gender as well as the same social rank. It was considered very distasteful for a noble to attack one of their servants in public. That sort of thing was done in private. The public displays were meant to defend one's honor. Your man cheats on you, so you attack the other woman because we are somehow inexplicably trained to believe it is her fault and not the lying, cheating, dirty, filthy man's. And in 1609, you better hope the woman your man cheated with was of the same social rank, because otherwise, you were just plain out of luck. The legal code allowed for the use of weapons. So, in addition to scratching and hair pulling, women most often used bludgeoning types of tools and targeted areas of beauty or vitality, childbearing areas, anything like that. The men typically used swords and knives and went for vital organs. They aimed for the head and neck a lot because being hit in the head was like the ultimate diss. You could be stabbed through the heart, but if he got you in the head, mm, your loss of dignity was so much worse than your actual death. When it came to legal actions, servants were not allowed to bring charges against a noble. In fact, though allowed, most nobles did not bring legal charges against servants because they had the opportunity to mete out their own judgment. I mentioned in part one of Elizabeth's story how the noble family in charge of a particular estate, which included the villages, would rule over that property as if it were a country unto itself. This would be yet another reason that if the allegations of her years of ongoing crimes are true, Elizabeth was able to get away with such atrocities for so long. In October of 1609, when those 8 lower ranked noble ladies died under Elizabeth's care, their families were making some noise. But again, George, whose rank as the Palatine of Hungary gave him and only him the power to charge a noble person with any crime, he was preoccupied. George was conspiring with King Matthias to gain control over the man who had become the Prince of Transylvania in 1608, Elizabeth's second cousin and previous ward of her brother, Gabriel Bathory. In March of 1610, approximately 5 months after the 8 girls had all died, there was an assassination attempt on Gabriel's life. It failed, and there's a decent amount of speculation as to who was truly behind the attempt. At this same time, in the spring of 1610, Matthias's brother Rudolph charged their longtime political rival, the former Prince of Transylvania Sigmund, with conspiracy. If you remember, Sigmund had already been forced to abdicate to Boxai, the Transylvanian prince who ended up being a bad bet for the Hungarian royals. Then Sigmund was forced out of Transylvania and onto lands that remained under Rudolph's control. Now that Sigmund was formally charged with conspiring against the Habsburgs, he was imprisoned at the Prague castle where Rudolph now held court. Still in March of 1610, King Matthias tells George that, you know what, I have been hearing some bad things about Elizabeth Bathory, terrible things, horrible, unimaginable rumors that he just can no longer ignore. Not because she's the high ranking and powerful relative of the Transylvanian prince, who is also high ranking and powerful with all that land he owns in royal Hungary that he inherited from Elizabeth's brother. And not because Elizabeth owns valuable land that happens to be strategically located and large enough to say, house a Transylvanian army led by that prince who, you know, mentioned a time or two how he thought that he would be the best king for royal Hungary. Nor was Matthias so suddenly alarmed over the fact that many of these rumors were about Elizabeth and her so called medical staff practicing devil magic on the peasantry. He didn't care that those people were rumored to be dying left and right. No, the part Matthias just could no longer overlook was that Elizabeth had the audacity to start plucking her victims straight from the ranks of his noble families. Lower ones that he didn't really pay attention to, but still they were noble, and you just can't go around killing nobles. Matthias tells George it is time they investigate what is really going on inside Elizabeth's castle. That same month, in March of 1610, George sent two men into the villages where Elizabeth had lived when Francis was alive, the place where her son and his Elizabeth hating tutor still live, and into these 17 villages surrounding her current castle. These men asked around about Elizabeth, and it wasn't long before their ears were full of stories about Elizabeth and her witch squad. One such tale was about the time, way back when Francis was still alive, that a girl stole a pear from the Bathory family. Elizabeth ordered the girl to be stripped right down to her birthday suit, then redressed in nothing but honey and tied to a tree in the courtyard, surrounded by all the wonderful little insects that bite and sting. The girl was left there to bake in the sun as punishment for her crime of being hungry. The problem with that kind of story, though, was that it was perfectly acceptable under the law. The inquiry that George's men were conducting needed to unearth something criminal, something a noblewoman could be charged and tried for. It was fully within George's purview to hunt for such a crime. As ordered by the king, George was to conduct this inquest, collect the rumors, and determine whether or not there was enough evidence to arrest Elizabeth. In so doing, the men he sent out to seek the truth were inevitably spurring the villagers to speak out against Elizabeth. They claimed that the bloody woman of Čachtický was meting out punishments far more severe than what was allowed for based on the crimes that were being committed. But the villagers started saying that Elizabeth wasn't even punishing people for crimes, that her cruelty was simply for her own sick pleasure. Many villagers spoke to George's men about the time when their brother's cousin's friend's sister fell ill, only to die after being given over to the care of Elizabeth and her entourage of witches. Now, the villagers didn't know these people personally, but they heard all about the dying, mainly of young girls. And as the winds blew that rumor mill to and fro, the number of victims began to tick up, up, and up. Elizabeth hears about what's going on, and I'm sure as we move from March of 1610 to September of 1610, she is gaining a pretty clear picture of what George, under the direction of King Matthias, intends to do. But we need to make a pit stop in June of 1610 when George is sent to a place now in modern day Romania to meet with Gabriel Bathory to try to reach some agreement about royal Hungary. Specifically, how Gabriel would stop saying he was going to unite royal Hungary with Transylvania under his rule, meaning he intended to kick Matthias off the throne. Well, the meeting was pretty short because Gabriel told George that he could not negotiate with him because Gabriel was sovereign and George was nothing more than a lord's serf. Gabriel then goes about what he's been doing, trying to conquer and control and draw people to his side to take on royal Hungary, where he still owns and makes money off of a bunch of the land. In August of 1610, a tentative deal is made with royal Hungary where Gabriel agrees to stop trying to take over. But this time it is King Matthias who rejects this deal because by this time, Gabriel has amassed quite an army, and the agreement does not include wording that says Transylvania has to come to the aid of royal Hungary in times of war, which was pretty much always. In September of 1610, approximately 6 months into the witch hunt turned smear campaign against Elizabeth, the intelligent countess pins a will, leaving all of her current possessions and holdings to her children, and also naming them as heirs for any and all of her future inheritances, because remember, the blood running through her veins connects her to not only noble families within many countries, but the royal families of those many countries So whether or not someone dies with or without an heir, her kids could still eventually connect back into the wealth of her parents. And to royals like her uncle, the King of Poland, the man she wrote a letter to asking her dear uncle if he would ensure her safe passage should she decide to come visit him there in Poland. He says, "Yes, of course, my sweet, innocent, powerful, influential, wealthy countess. I am so glad that my many wars with the Habsburgs there in Hungary have not soured our relations. At any time, should you wish to flee, I mean, casually cross the borders and visit your magnanimous uncle, I give you my word that you shall receive all necessary paperwork to ensure that you arrive safely in Poland." I'm paraphrasing their correspondence, obviously, as I will continue to do with the next piece of correspondence, the proverbial nail in Elizabeth's coffin. This letter was written by the Lutheran pastor of Elizabeth's dower, the Čachtický castle. Now, even though Elizabeth never persecuted those of a different faith who lived in her villages and even helped further their impact by educating their ministers, these religious men categorically did not like the Red Lady. The Lutheran pastor from her husband's estate in Charvar was the one who went all the way to Versailles to complain about her. And now this one from her very own castle grounds is writing to inform King Matthias and the Palatine, George Thurzo himself, about the true depths of the horrors being committed by Elizabeth. This pastor supposedly had a history of trying to devalue Elizabeth, going out of his way to undermine her decisions. If that is indeed true and not a matter of perspective, I am sure his desire to have more authority than the haggard old widow had no impact whatsoever on what he wrote in this letter. He is a preacher man, after all. They don't lie and make up stories to evoke emotions of fear in people, and they certainly do not go around manipulating situations for their own gain. This is why Pastor Jonas's claims of witchcraft are so serious. In his letter, Jonas revealed that the Blood Countess was a shapeshifter. It's true. She had the power to turn herself into a black cat, and at night she would transform herself into this cat and stalk the pastor wherever he went. Worse than that, and probably because cats are part demon, he informed the king that Elizabeth was a cannibal, that her and the squad of witches she rolled with were eating people. That's enough on its own, but Jonas didn't stop there. He was spilling all of the tea because the worst part of this for him was the dead bodies. He was practically tripping over them. In fact, you know those 8 dead noble ladies who were part of Elizabeth's first class of etiquette students? Jonas is the one who found their discarded bodies. They were in the catacombs that connected his chapel to the castle, unceremoniously decomposing where the vile, Calvinist, black cat, shape-shifting cannibal Elizabeth Bathory ordered that these poor dead girls be thrown. He also said it wasn't 8 bodies down there, it was 9. You can imagine the uproar this letter caused, especially after Pastor Maggiore had personally traveled to Versailles to also complain about Elizabeth and her well-dressed squad of witches. This is now 2 Lutheran pastors who openly despise Elizabeth, attacking her starting only 1 short month after her husband died. And now it is super convenient for Matthias and George to actually care about what these priests have been saying. Not enough to go see if there are actually 9 bodies in the catacombs. They've been collecting rumors, and now they have this well-penned letter, so they don't need corroborating evidence. They have what they need already: complaints from the Lutheran Church, complaints from lesser noble families, and a boatload of rumors. George also has a moral dilemma on his hands because he has not forgotten the deathbed request of his friend, Francis Natoshy, asking George to take care of his family and specifically charging George with their protection. Well, by October of 1610, right when Elizabeth is figuring out the details of her will, George's men have provided 52 witness statements accusing Francis's widow of maiming, torturing, and killing hundreds of women, with some of those hearsay allegations dating all the way back to 1590. George decided there were simply too many allegations to let them go unanswered, which brought him to the next part of his dilemma. His job was not to represent the common folk. He was a representative of the noble class. So if one of them was brought up on charges, he had to make sure there was a solid case. Otherwise, the rest of the noble families would rebel, and George was not trying to get himself thrown out of his newfound societal rank. If Elizabeth had indeed murdered those daughters of the lesser noble families, then she was able to be charged under Hungary's legal code. If put on trial and then found guilty of the capital crime of murder, she would lose her head. And that beheading would set a series of events in motion, which would all be aimed at stripping away status and wealth from not only the Bathory family, but from the Natoshays also. To keep Elizabeth's family from facing the consequences of being guilty by association, George enacted a plan that would allow him to represent Elizabeth as a noble who was as above the law as the rest of them, while still moving forward with the prosecution that Matthias was demanding. A plan that I am sure made George feel as if he had kept his promise to his longtime friends, and all while keeping himself rooted solely on middle ground, where he could both mete out justice while staying in the good political graces of the king. George wrote letters to Elizabeth's family. Her son Paul was still too young to make legal decisions, so George included Paul's guardian and tutor, a man aligned with the Lutheran pastors when it came to his dislike of Elizabeth. The letters to represent Elizabeth's daughters were directed to their husbands. He told these now four men that he had been investigating Elizabeth, which I am sure at least the tutor already knew. And George filled them in on the results of his inquest, as well as his intent to arrest Elizabeth. This led to a secret negotiation between the family and George, and on December the 13th of 1610, Nikolai, Elizabeth's son-in-law, who basically outranked the other men at this point, signed an agreement with George. This agreement wasn't the legal standard, but when dealing with the aristocracy, the legal system still tends to be a little flexible. So George made this agreement, and happily so, it seems. The agreement said that the family would not challenge him so long as all he did was arrest Elizabeth. She was not to face trial. After the arrest, she would be sent to a convent where she would remain out of sight and out of mind, the family figuratively washing their hands of her, disowning her, all the things they had to do in order to distance themselves, allowing the family to keep their good name intact and their good money in their pockets. Which is why Nikolai only gave George the go-ahead to arrest Elizabeth after her will was finalized. The ownership of her estates and all of her possessions already transferred to her children. Via Elizabeth's daughters, her two sons-in-laws gained a lot, and just days after she finalized all of these transfers, Nikolai gave the green light for her to be arrested. The agreement between George and the family only applied to Elizabeth. The men all agreed that Elizabeth's cohorts could be tried and face punishment without any objection. All the family demanded was that George keep Elizabeth herself from going to trial. It wasn't often that nobles were tried for anything and just as rare to have a woman, no less a noblewoman, accused of murder. The rumors were bad enough. If this thing went to trial, Elizabeth had little chance of winning, and the sensational nature of the case would create a public scandal that could very well cost the family everything. On Christmas Eve of 1610, George, among a delegation of people sent by and including King Matthias himself, attended a Christmas celebration at Čachtický castle. Elizabeth was no fool. She knew exactly why they were attending her banquet. So during dinner, when George began to casually bring up the complaints of the lesser nobles, wondering why those girls died and why Elizabeth wouldn't give the bodies back to the families, she produced a letter from one of the mothers of the dead. I'd like to think this letter was folded up and stored in her cleavage, and she just slipped it out and tossed it into George's salad bowl. This letter was a signed statement from one of the supposedly complaining lesser noblewomen, stating that she knew for a fact that her daughter had died from an outbreak of a disease, not from any wrongdoing on Elizabeth's part. One of Elizabeth's servants also confirmed the story, and Elizabeth stuck to it, telling George and Matthias that all of the girls had died during yet another outbreak. As for why their bodies were not returned to the families, well, first of all, Elizabeth wasn't actually in the castle when the girls died, something there is documentation to prove. She was with her daughter and some of her staff traveling to one of their other villages. When the girls fell ill, they were quarantined and then cared for by her other servants. When the girls died, her servants freaked out a little bit. A lot of the girls had been dying in and around the castle, and they thought Elizabeth was going to be mad. And dead girls don't equal tuition. And what if Elizabeth had to give the money she had already gotten back to the families of these girls? Elizabeth told the men that her servant's solution to the problem had been just to not tell Elizabeth the girls had died. I mean, Elizabeth at least wouldn't notice while she was away traveling. As for dumping the bodies of the girls here and there instead of burying them, the woman in charge of that claimed that the Lutheran minister who was complaining about them refused to let the girls be buried in the cemetery. He said too many girls had been dying and that the servants of the castle could not dig any more graves on his land unless he personally inspected the bodies, which wasn't safe because of the disease and all, and also it's a little weird. So the servants simply had no choice but to stick the bodies in the catacombs and in the garden and a few just out in the yard, because it wasn't only those noble ladies who were dying, and there are only so many places where one can conceal a body. George continued to push Elizabeth on the rumors he'd heard, and she kept throwing up her hands, telling him there was nothing happening in her castle except for the outbreak of disease. And she did not care about the claims that dogs were running around with body parts hanging out of their mouths. These people were sick, and she was trying to help them. Furthermore, it isn't Elizabeth's fault if her servants refuse to tell her when people die. She's got a lot on her plate and she is doing the best she can. So just get off of her back. George says, yeah, okay, but we have to deal with all of these rumors. The villagers are saying you torture people for fun. Is it true that you are out here making girls strip naked and roll around in stinging nettles? Elizabeth said, yes, it is, because if you bothered to read a medical textbook, George, you would know that right there in black and white, the medical text says that you treat rheumatism by rolling a patient's entire naked body in stinging nettle. George crosses his arms over his chest. Oh, yeah? Well, what about you whipping these girls until their flesh falls straight off of their bones? Outraged, Elizabeth throws her napkin down and glares at George. First of all, torturing servants is not a crime. And you know what else, George? your friend and my husband, the hero of Hungary, gave me some of my best moves, like how to put some pep into the step of a lazy servant. You know the ones I'm talking about. They contract the bubonic plague and then suddenly they just want to sleep all of the time, knowing full well that the one thing doctors say not to do when you have the plague is sleep. So Francis showed Elizabeth how all you have to do is douse pieces of paper in oil and then roll those papers up and stick them between the servant's toes. And then you light those papers on fire. That sure gets them moving. George does not like her descriptions of well known medical procedures of the time. So he hits her with, well, Francis would never let the rightful torture of his servants go far enough to kill them. And what about these midwives I'm hearing about? You're hiring women to be midwives, and one of them was a Croatian? Elizabeth is piping hot now. She lurches out of her chair, informing George that she hired women to treat women so that women didn't have to deal with pigs dressed in men's skin, putting their filthy hooves all over them. Obviously, I don't know what their exact conversation was. And on a personal note, my OB was a man and he was great. I've encountered a couple of other medical professions that I'd categorize as those aforementioned pigs. However, gender does not a monster make, unlike menopause. And during this time, Elizabeth is the right age to be in perimenopause, which is the worst of it all. I can attest to that. So on this night of the banquet, George did press her on the rumors and she did get mad and storm out of her own party. The next day, rumor has it that both George and Matthias were sick, possibly having been poisoned by Elizabeth. Neither man died, though, and after Elizabeth stormed out of the banquet, George went back to Elizabeth's family, telling them he was moving forward with her arrest. And soon, because Matthias was breathing down his neck. The family agreed that the arrest should happen with speed. They needed to put this whole ordeal behind them, something they could not do if Elizabeth had enough time to flee Hungary, in which case she would become a fugitive and suspicion would fall on her family. Her son-in-law, Nikolai, wrote to George informing him that on December the 29th, Nikolai's own men would be at Elizabeth's castle and that they would escort George and his men through the gates and into the castle where they could surprise Elizabeth with an arrest party, something George could do without any prior notice to Elizabeth, because when it came to the capital crime of murder, Hungary's legal code did not require that a noble family member receive any prior summons or notification. So that night on December the 29th, while Elizabeth was having dinner, George, accompanied by a small group of soldiers, the Lutheran minister, Paul's tutor, and Nikolai's men, walked right onto the castle grounds without meeting a single bit of resistance. They then marched through the halls of Čachtický, found Elizabeth, arrested her, and began to methodically separate all of her servants. Elizabeth was to be locked in her own dungeons while the men interrogated her staff. According to a letter George wrote to his wife, on their way down to those dungeons, they found a dead girl in one of the hallways. As they continued on, they found another girl. This one George referred to as living prey, indicating that she had been victimized by Elizabeth, but thankfully found alive. This girl would go on to make a full recovery from the injuries she had sustained prior to having been brought to the castle, where her family hoped the Countess and her medical team would be able to treat and care for the girl. A calculation they made based on the fact that it was the responsibility of the noble family in charge of the villages to take care of the medical needs of their tenants. In the last episode, I outlined how it seems that Elizabeth took this duty very seriously, with letters from that time detailing the variety of medical services that Elizabeth provided for her people. Nevertheless, George blames the girl's condition on Elizabeth, and he and his men report that they caught the three of Elizabeth's servants cleaning up this girl's blood, which had been spilled during her last torture session. These 3 servants were immediately arrested and sent off to be interrogated about their involvement in the goings-on inside of the castle. Ilonia, who had been the wet nurse for all of Elizabeth's children, Katerina, and Dorothea all made confessions while undergoing sessions of torture under orders from George. The irony of them being accused of torturing people while being tortured by the authorities is lost on no one. However, being tortured into confession was not only allowed under the law, it was so common that it was expected. And though some records of torture were kept, it was often not detailed because it was just a given that whatever the apprehended party said was uttered during torture. This was the case here, not only with these 3 women who had been caught red-handed, but with other servants being questioned at the time. Generally, the types of allowed torture under the law included using implements intended to inflict wounds that would eventually heal. Basically, you couldn't outright kill witnesses or cut off a limb, the same rules applying to the noble families in terms of how they were allowed to deal with their servants. Showing people the implements and threatening to use them was allowed, so witness intimidation, waterboarding, burning flesh with hot irons, driving nails into body parts, taking great care to avoid all vital organs because humans are not monsters after all. You get the idea here. Pretty much any physical atrocity was on the table, along with starvation, sleep deprivation, being subjected to watching someone else and probably someone you care about being tortured. And last but not least, being forced to take a drug that might make you hallucinate. It was good times back then, great vibes. I mean, I can see why these people were so upset that Elizabeth chose to wear a red dress after her husband died. She crossed a line, guys. Even torture had rules, so the aristocracy was right to be upset with her. According to their laws, a person could only be tortured 3 times, and if they did not confess during those sessions, well, then they probably were not guilty. Additionally, each session was only supposed to last around half an hour, and after each session, you got a break, time to recover. If you were bleeding, they would wait for the bleeding to stop. I mean, it was all very civil. The torture sessions even escalated. So if you confessed in the first one, then you did not have to deal with getting drugged and having nails pounded into your arms. So really, if that happened to you, it was your own fault. Guys, this stuff is real, and I would love to go on a rant about hypocrisy and how, in essence, we have flipped the tables today and let people whose violent crimes are caught on camera have show trials, and then we house them in fancy prisons and let them whine about being cold because no one gave them warm enough blankets. But we don't have time for that. Before we move on from this topic, though, I also want to point out that in the transcripts from the interrogations, George declared that each confession given by a defendant had been given either voluntarily or after torture. If the translation of what he wrote is accurate, his use of the word after does have a special meaning under the law because the legal code had a clause that said if the person being tortured were to deny their confession after the torture was over, then they would not be held to the confession that was given under duress. I am not clear on exactly how this denial played into the 3 torture sessions because it is said that they had to deny the confession 3 times after 3 torture sessions. And if they did deny it 3 times, well, then they were acquitted. So was this an additional 3 torture sessions from the point of denial? So if they didn't deny it until after the original 3rd, then they could get 3 more. So that would be 6 sessions altogether. I'm just not sure. But those scholars who believe George acted accordingly and followed the law and that Elizabeth and her servants were guilty point to this clause to say that none of the servants went on to recant their confessions. So therefore, they must have been guilty. Now, this situation unfolding in Elizabeth's castle was on sort of a seemingly rushed timeline, with the speculation being that George fully intended to honor the family agreement and not bring Elizabeth to trial. He had to do something, though, for King Matthias. So George orchestrated this whole situation during the holidays when the governing body of Hungary would be out of the office. In fact, by the time they were back in session, 2 trials will have happened. Regardless, records indicate that the original questioning of the servants focused on where the bodies were buried. There were a lot of dead people around there, so the servants had no problem telling George's men where to look. They only dug up one of the bodies, though, and I think it's rather telling that this is the only body they had. First, they had to dig it up from out in the courtyard where the decomposing body had been buried for a couple of months. Secondly, what about the dead girl they supposedly found in the hallway? The only body they ever used as evidence was the one they dug up from the courtyard. As the story goes, the colder weather of the fall and early winter had preserved this body in such a way that George presented the dead girl as a fresh kill. On December the 30th, George had his men construct a platform in the courtyard. Upon this platform, he laid the body of the recently unearthed girl and the body of the young woman who was there at the castle being treated for the injuries she had recently obtained. George then invited all of the nobles from estates that bordered Elizabeth to join her villages in gawking at these bodies. No one was allowed to get up close to the bodies. They were made to view them from a distance, lest anyone realize that there was no way the dead girl was the very same girl that George claimed to have found dead in the hallway. Likewise, if the injured girl were able to speak, I'm sure they did not want her telling anyone what really happened to her. These onlookers were told that any grotesqueness that they were seeing was a direct result of the torture these young ladies had endured at the hands of Elizabeth and her staff. While George was making these bold proclamations, he brought Elizabeth out into the courtyard, forcing her to stand before these 2 girls to view what she had done. We know from the clerical records of the event that there was never a freshly dead girl found, and that the other girl was a patient brought to Elizabeth, not one Elizabeth created via torture. It is thus believed that George created the spectacle to solidify in the minds of the villagers and other nobles that all of the rumors they had been hearing were true. This served the purpose of witness tampering, as many of those viewing the bodies would then come forward with their rumor-filled stories. And it is also publicly humiliating Elizabeth, most likely to keep the other nobles from coming to her aid. This show put on in the courtyard is the Hollywood equivalent of getting stink on someone or writing a hit piece about them. George was dialing in on exactly who he wanted to prosecute, but that person could not be Elizabeth. So he dethroned her via humiliation and made sure he had the witnesses to back up his charges against the servants. He was now up to 5 accomplices, and each of them confessed to helping Elizabeth in her crimes and gave details about their roles. Moving rapidly with the capital crime of murder, George charged the original 3 servants who had been caught helping the injured girl, a teenage boy known as the dwarf, and another servant who had originally escaped. On January the 2nd of 1611, he held the first part of the trial, and they list this as 2 separate trials, but really it's one big trial, and this is the first part. This one was a private proceeding following the rules of common inquest that he had been working under up until this time. Each witness who was called had their name, occupation, and connection to Elizabeth recorded. 4 of these witnesses were Elizabeth's now named co-conspirators. The 5th one hadn't been caught quite yet because, again, George is moving very rapidly here. And all of you can decide if you think this was for nefarious reasons or in an effort to wrap this up and help Elizabeth avoid trial, thus protecting her and her family. The servants were all asked a series of the exact same 11 questions. These questions were supposed to be designed to get the answers George wanted. Each of these 4 servants answered yes, that everything they did was on direct orders from Elizabeth. However, she is not the name they gave for being the actual responsible party. Each of the 4 servants testified that the person who taught and trained Elizabeth, the person who infected their household with these barbaric methods of torture, was Elizabeth's longtime friend and top midwife, the Croatian witch that the villagers had so feared, the now dead from a stroke, Anna, the only person not around to speak for herself. To me, that is another point in the column of George trying to help Elizabeth because he told these people what to say. He also had them describe in their own words what their role in the murders was. Ilyona, the wet nurse, said there had been 50 murders and that the cruel Croatian Anna just loved committing those crimes. Duracha had been with Elizabeth nearly as long as the wet nurse, and she said that under Anna's cruel leadership, they killed 55 people. Many of the other servants said that while Anna was indeed terrible, it was Duracha who got the most pleasure out of murdering people, and that her methods of torture were far worse than anything Anna or Elizabeth ever did. The teenage dwarf testified that he, along with Ilonia, brought victims to Elizabeth. He claimed the number of victims to be 45, but said he did not do any of the torturing or killing because he wasn't ever allowed in the room. He was only the lowly errand boy. Katerina said she did not have anything to do with anything. She didn't recruit victims. She didn't kill or torture. All she did was clean up afterwards and get rid of the bodies. She claimed that in the time she had worked for the Countess, the death toll was 35. Other witnesses were then allowed to testify. All of them were ordinary people, which is why, according to the rules of the Common Inquest, they could not speak positively or in favor of Elizabeth. Only nobles could do such a thing because the law deemed that the lower classes were too easily influenced by the wealth and power of the nobles. However, not a single noble testified on Elizabeth's behalf, not even her family, because this trial was not for Elizabeth, so they had no reason to. Additionally, hearsay evidence was not allowed to be used against nobility, but it could be used against servants. And since this trial was not aimed at Elizabeth, but at her servants, George allowed witnesses to testify completely based on rumors, even with their testimony being damning to Elizabeth, not specifically the servants. The witnesses made it clear that what they were testifying to was nothing but third-party hearsay, and therefore, we presume, George deemed it was fine to smear Elizabeth in this way. The first witness was a pastor who said that he heard that Elizabeth was really, really, really cruel. He didn't know if that was true or not, but that's what he heard. So that's what he is repeating. The priest who wrote the letter saying that Elizabeth turned into a cat at night and stalked him also testified, as did many others, because the villagers' fear of Anna already had them primed to believe the healing practices Elizabeth employed were black magic, as evidenced by one of the most detailed testimonies that was recorded. This testimony was given by a man who worked at the castle in Sharvar, where Elizabeth spent most of her life. He claimed that she killed at least 175 people. In one account, of which he was an actual eyewitness to the events, he said that Elizabeth took the shoemaker's daughter and stripped her naked. Then Elizabeth shoved knives into the girl's fingers and into both of her arms. Then she flogged the girl and held a candle to the girl's hands until the skin there was burned. Shortly thereafter, the girl died. The man wasn't sure what actually caused the girl to die, but in his estimation, he believed that it was because Elizabeth had tortured the shoemaker's daughter to death. In another account, he detailed the many occasions when he had witnessed Elizabeth torturing her seamstresses. He said she would strip the girls naked and beat them on their hands and fingers until those areas were busted up and swollen. Then she would force those girls to pick up a needle and thread and begin to sew, all while berating them, demanding that they keep sewing while shouting lewd remarks and calling them filthy, demeaning names in the process. Should one of the seamstresses be so infected and swollen that she just could not continue to sew, this man claimed that Elizabeth would complain to the rest of her staff, telling them to look at what a useless, spoiled, explicitive the seamstress was. Then Elizabeth would stick needles in the still naked girl, piercing the seamstress's arms all the way up to the shoulders, after which she would beat the girl using different bludgeoning instruments. But was this behavior an act of torture for the sake of satisfying Elizabeth's cruel desires, or was she trying to help these seamstresses? In those days, it was common for a seamstress to get a condition called fingernail poison that apparently had the girls developing some form of boils on their hands and along their nail beds. This condition was treated by basically popping those boils and cutting them out. In some ways, I guess we could sort of argue that this was the gist of what Elizabeth was doing in these described episodes. But if everything the man attested to was true, then it seems like the berating, stripping girls naked, and forcing them to sew while their hands were all bloody pulps isn't part of the medical plan. I also don't see why she would want a girl whose hands are bleeding to sew. I mean, the blood is going to get on the fabric. So that stood out to me. I have no idea if it's a point for this being a medical exercise or a torture session, or maybe just some embellishment by the witness. It's just another one of those things in this case that make you go, hmm. Another part of this man's testimony describes a time when Elizabeth was traveling and one of the servants ate a biscuit the girl was supposed to only be holding onto. When Elizabeth asked for the two biscuits she had started out with, finding out that now she only had one, Elizabeth heated the other biscuit up until it was piping hot and then shoved it into the servant girl's mouth. He also told of another situation that occurred when Elizabeth ordered that a servant girl be stripped down, thrown outside in the winter weather, and soaked with buckets of water until the girl froze to death. Other witnesses testified to similar events, with most of those happening while Elizabeth and her witch squad were traveling between villages. While some claim that this was a form of punishment that Elizabeth heaped upon servants who complained about being cold or tired or hungry, the medical text of that day did have a method of treating high fevers by alternating between cold and hot baths and doing other things that would induce sweating. Another common practice when dealing with a bubonic plague victim was that if they began to have constant diarrhea while also having a high fever, medical providers were advised to frequently clean the person's body with cold water. I can imagine that in times of various plagues, when someone came down with a fever, it was a scary thing. And if it got too far and nothing was bringing the fever down, a Hail Mary for these people might have been a barbaric measure of throwing a person out in the snow and dumping water on them. The male servant from Sharvar had some other events to tell the court about, ones that he had not been an eyewitness to. He said that other servants related to him that on several occasions, Elizabeth had given orders for a wide fire iron to be heated and then pressed into the arms of girls until their flesh was black and smoking. He then said she ordered that a smaller, round iron be heated and, on his honor, shoved inside of the girls. Now, that's unconscionable, and I can't imagine how anyone would ever think to do such a thing. However, I am trying to be as fair as possible here, and in various medical texts from those days, where the accepted medical practices are barbaric to say the least, the use of hot irons on the body was a common procedure, with one of those uses being to cauterize open wounds. So while we find these deeds to be unbelievably cruel, and the villagers testifying against Elizabeth outline these things as torture, not medical treatment, when we look at the types of the things they said, they heard happened, and then what the medical texts say, there is a bit of an alignment. For instance, some of the witnesses said Elizabeth would shove needles or knives into the lips, tongues, and noses of some of her victims. However, a condition called frog of the tongue referred to an abscess underneath the tongue that was best treated by piercing a hole through the tongue and even by slicing through the vein beneath the tongue. Smallpox, typhus, and the bubonic plague had measures where boils and blisters were cut out of the body, no matter where they were on a person's body. And then hot instruments like bricks and those fire irons were used as a compress on the ensuing wounds. So when the stories say Elizabeth and her colleagues cut the flesh from bodies of young girls, it probably actually did happen, and this could be why. The part where witnesses claimed that Elizabeth cut chunks out of the backsides of some of her victims and then cooked and fed them their own flesh, well, there are some precedents for people doing things like this and in much more modern times. Witnesses also claimed that girls were chained up and beat across the private parts, that their mouths were forced shut with clamps, their fingers cut off with scissors, their flesh ripped from the bones with pliers, and that candles were used to singe their nether regions. Meanwhile, medical books condoned the painful experiences of having dead, infected, or maggot infested wounds cut or torn from the body using red hot instruments like pliers or sharp knives. They also thought it was a good idea to clean the wounds with salt water. And when it came to those whiny plague sufferers, a Transylvanian doctor who was popular at the time and who would have been impactful on Elizabeth due to her mother's heritage and Elizabeth's mother being the one to pass on her medical knowledge to her daughter. This Transylvanian doctor said the best thing for someone suffering from a plague was to put some pep into their step, because if you pampered these people, it would only make their illness worse. So when she tells you her swollen hands hurt too much to sew, you berate her like the sick woman she is. The good doctor believed that this bolstering was a way to ramp up the patient's immune system. And because I would be remiss not to mention bloodletting in many of the treatments for anything from abscesses to epilepsy, it was commonly thought that cutting a person and letting them bleed a little was a good thing. It's also rumored that Elizabeth had epilepsy as a child and may have relapsed and therefore began to both torture people by cutting them open and also by drinking their blood, because in addition to having your own blood drained, a treatment for epilepsy could be to drink the blood of others. Two immediate problems with this epilepsy line is that during the trials, not a single person mentioned that Elizabeth drank anyone's blood. There was the pastor who said she and her ladies were cannibals, But during trial, what came out was that she fed flesh to her victims, not partook of it herself. To my knowledge, there's also no evidence that she had epilepsy. It's my understanding that a scholar writing hundreds of years after the fact speculated that if Elizabeth had epilepsy, some of her blood drinking ways would then be explained. But like the blood drinking and the biting of servants, these things were not spoken of during trial, only in text that came over a century after she died, because the first book ever written about her came more than 100 years after Elizabeth died. When it comes to verifiable records, it seems that there is a great connection between the sweep of an epidemic and when people died under Elizabeth's care. Furthermore, many of the witnesses admitted that Elizabeth wasn't present when a lot of these girls died because she was off seeing to the affairs of her many villages. Additionally, the fact that most of her victims were female makes sense because the men were all off at war for a vast majority of the time period when these people were dying on her estates. Still, 36 people testified at the trial, saying that even though Elizabeth was not present for every event, she ordered all of the atrocities, and she had done so because of evil Anna. George took this information and pushed the Inquisition forward into the second trial, or just phase 2 of the one trial, which was the public portion of the trial. The first part was to get the evidence on record. The second part was a public recounting of the statements from the first part of the trial, and also to add nearly 300 additional witness statements. These were presumably from anyone and everyone who felt like standing up and speaking out against Elizabeth. Additionally, in the second phase, George would read the charges out loud to the public, let them see and hear for themselves what the evidence was, and then render his judgment. While in the first part of the trial, all of the witnesses had been recorded, in the second part, they didn't bother to write everyone down, nor did they transcribe the goings on with any great amount of detail. They recorded more of a summary. This trial took place days after the first on January the 7th of 1611. Droves of people testified that they had seen the traces of torture on the dead body that George had presented in the courtyard. Others recounted stories they'd heard about torture that was happening in the dungeons, and even in the kitchens and the bathhouses of Elizabeth's castle estates. The 99th witness said that he could not answer any of the court's questions because he had no personal knowledge of any crime, but he had heard from everyone what the lady widow had done. 61 other witnesses echoed his testimony, and another 98 came right out and said that every word out of their mouth was nothing but hearsay. One person conveniently missing from the witness list was the young girl who was used as the caught red-handed victim. Maybe she was still too ill and couldn't be subjected to the trial, or maybe George did not want the one witness who actually knew whether or not she was tortured speaking to the villagers. No one was allowed to speak on Elizabeth's behalf, so if the girl would have vindicated the lady widow, she could have been told, thanks, but no thanks. In the end, after taking into consideration the statements of 300 witnesses, George declared that the 3 women he'd caught red-handed, the teenage male dwarf, and the servant they'd had to track down, were all guilty of the capital crime of murder, a crime to which they had each already confessed. The lowest number of victims named was 35, and the highest came from a peasant woman who claimed that she'd heard from an official within Elizabeth's own court that the Countess kept records of who she killed, and that the court official had taken a peek inside Elizabeth's little red book and saw a staggering tally of 650 people. Now, this court official also testified, and funny enough, when he did not mention the book or the high tally, nor was the record book ever produced as evidence. Still, after taking into account all of these statements and the outright confessions from the servants charged with capital murder, George determined that the servants were, in fact, guilty. Because the physical and psychological torture the servants had already undergone was not considered punishment, and witness intimidation was no reason to invalidate the confessions, George ordered that the two eldest servants, Ionia, the wet nurse, and Dracha, the cruelest of them all, have their fingers torn off by a pair of red hot pliers. The transcripts are all in Hungarian, and some people translated this as having their hands entirely severed. I don't know. It is just horrible either way. After they were mutilated, these two women were burned alive. The teenage boy was given a lighter sentence since he was not the one actually doing the torturing and killing. He was beheaded, and then his body was burned on the same pyre as the two previous servants. The servant who had originally escaped was caught and then burned alive like the two older women. But Katerina, the servant who didn't know anything about anything because all she did was clean up and get rid of the bodies, George had sympathy on her. The girl provided evidence showing that the other servants were mean to her. So she got to live. She was given a life sentence, sent off to prison, let out a few years later, and never heard from again. If you are watching a video version, I will have her name up on the screen for you because if her descendants haven't already been tracked down, someone needs to get on this mystery because you know as well as I do that Katerina talked. I bet there are some old stories passed down through her generations or some old relic, something of the past that might either exonerate all of them or finally close the loop on their guilt. She was the one who literally knew where the bodies were buried, with none but one of those bodies ever being exhumed. Elizabeth never publicly spoke for herself, and there were many reasons for this, one of them surely being the prompting of her family to keep her mouth shut. There was going to be a trial one way or another, and the boys in the family worked out a sweet deal. All Elizabeth had to do was sit back and be quiet while George rushed her servants off to be slaughtered. The family was also going to remain silent, and in exchange for their help and complacency, George would ensure that Elizabeth herself would never face trial. Because if she did, the entire family would risk losing their political, financial, and social standing. They could be stripped of their noble status because under the law, murder was one of a few reasons a person could be demoted. If Elizabeth went to trial, the family would have suffered no matter the outcome of the trial, which left them between a rock and a hard place. The way to get through this was with as little damage as possible. So they signed the agreement that Elizabeth would be locked away, which by standards in those days meant that the person was legally dead, and with no trial to speak of, her deeds would no longer be stains on the family name. Keeping Elizabeth from ever being seen in public again was a statement by the family as to whether or not they believed there was sufficient evidence against Elizabeth. However, it doesn't really say whether they believed the evidence was real or exaggerated. It really only speaks to the fact that they needed this to go away, and they needed it to go away quickly. Home confinement was something only given to the wealthy or to the mentally handicapped. It is for this reason that many people speculate that Elizabeth was crazy and that some kind of insanity ran in her family. I debunked this a bit in the last episode, and I will do so again here because if Elizabeth had an ailment like this, there is not a drop of evidence that she was ever treated for it. And there's a lot of evidence about medical treatment. So it seems logical that there would be letters outlining treatment given to Elizabeth both pre and post arrest. So I chalk this claim up to being just another one of the many embellishments that came later. Elizabeth's family fought for confinement simply because it was the best option for all of them. Originally, the agreement with George was that Elizabeth would be sent off to a convent, but for some reason, and possibly because of the interference of Paul's tutor, Elizabeth was allowed to stay in her castle at Čachtický. She was moved from the dungeons up to her private rooms and confined there. Meanwhile, George prepared some court documents, including those original statements from the first trial. And being careful to keep his agreement with Elizabeth's family secret, he wrote to Matthias on January the 25th of 1611, telling the king that Elizabeth had been taken care of. Her name was now Mud, and George added, for effect, that Elizabeth was locked inside her room, and then the room was bricked over, leaving only one small slot so that the beastly woman could be fed and receive a little air. The statement about the bricks was a lie, and I imagine was yet another way for George to attempt to keep Elizabeth out of standing trial, because if she's behind a brick wall, I mean, it's going to be hard to get her out of there. It's going to be a whole big ordeal. But it seems Matthias didn't really care, because he wrote George back and insisted that Elizabeth stand trial. If George were to follow the king's order, a few things would happen. Firstly, nobles would be called to testify. One of the nobles would be the mother of the one girl who had died and then wrote the letter that Elizabeth produced at Christmas, saying that the mother knew the daughter died of disease, not by anything Elizabeth did. This was evidence not produced at the trial of the servants, because it was a letter defending Elizabeth, not the servants. Furthermore, if Elizabeth was brought to trial, she would stand before a jury of her peers being nobles, the very nobles George was supposed to be representing. So while he and the king would also be at this trial, George would be stuck between showing his loyalty to the king he had just failed to thwart a prince for, and to the nobles who elected him to have his position as their palatine. Then there's the matter of the secret agreement that he signed with Elizabeth's family. So George was going to avoid a trial at all costs. Besides, the nobles were not pitching a fit that one of their own had been arrested and placed under home confinement. And these people were known to stick up for one another when it came to the king trying to violate their rights. Some have speculated that the lack of outrage from the noble class means that Elizabeth's dirty deeds were an open secret. Others say they wanted to see the Red Lady fall because she was so utterly unaffected by the stupidity of the aristocracy, while yet others argue that it was her power and widowhood that made the nobles turn a blind eye. Some nobles may have even been implicated themselves, but I think it was Elizabeth's far-reaching power and that of her family overall that kept people silent. It's best not to get involved when someone is being made an example of. Instead, you sit back and think about how you might capitalize on their misfortune, if you're an aristocrat. Therefore, George wrote back to Matthias and said, "My king, you need to trust me on this. A trial absolutely is not necessary. Elizabeth is now a demon in the eyes of villagers far and wide, and for all intents and purposes, she's dead. Her family has all of her possessions, but I've handled everything and we are wrapping up here, so just go take care of the spat that you are still having with Gabriel Bathory and let him know we just took down Elizabeth and got some dirt to use on her family should they give us any problems over here in royal Hungary." Matthias informed George that he would keep fighting with Transylvania and Poland and everyone else, but he also wanted Elizabeth Bathory to face trial for the murder of a noble, which he could have insisted that she be charged with witchcraft, but he did not. So Matthias really is not being unreasonable at all. The problem is that even though he is the king, he cannot force the trial to happen. George is the one who gets to make that call. All Matthias can do is rally other nobles to his cause in an attempt to put enough pressure on George that a trial would be the only option. George has already dug in his heels, though. He is not going to go so far off the rails that he totally fails to keep his friend's deathbed wish. What he is going to do is bend the rules a little more, rules that would come back to bite him should Elizabeth ever go to trial. Bite him in a way that would see to it that she was most likely acquitted. George's own wife wrote about how they gathered a bunch of false witnesses to testify against Elizabeth. And now George is taking testimony from people who openly hold grudges against Elizabeth. This is expressly forbidden under the law, but George did it anyway so he could provide something to Matthias to show that he was not completely ignoring the orders of his king. Some say this evidence that if presented at a trial for Elizabeth would muddy the waters and be cause to say that Elizabeth was a victim of propaganda rather than fact, was proof that George was ultimately on her side. Others say it's proof that he wanted to bury her no matter how legal the method. On July 28th of 1611, so just over 7 months into Elizabeth's house arrest, George wrote to King Matthias again, telling him that after questioning 224 witnesses, they found that Lady Bathory was guilty of animal savagery directed and driven by devilish sense, and that she cruelly killed numerous innocent virgins, nobles as well as lower class maids alike. He said the girls had done nothing wrong, but still Elizabeth had their bodies mutilated and burned with hot irons and pieces of flesh torn from them, then roasted in the fire and given to them to eat. While all of this sounds pretty damning, George continued to refuse to place Elizabeth on trial. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued to proclaim her innocence, while also changing her stories a time or two. And on occasion saying it was the servants who made her do those awful things. She even claimed that 2 of the original 8 noble ladies who died under her care were dead because one of the girls was caught stealing, and the noble girl who caught the noble thief then killed the noble thief. Then she was upset and killed herself. So between that and the ones who died of disease, none of the deaths were Elizabeth's fault, or even her servants. Elizabeth knew that if she went to trial and was found guilty, she would lose her head, and beheading was the ultimate loss of respect. George may have used the rumor mill to spread tales of her crimes until they became admissible in court under the common knowledge clause. But the manipulation of public opinion would be the least of her family's worries if she ever faced trial. The position of prestige that she was born into was not enough to save her. The nobles were not standing up for her. They were being uncharacteristically quiet, and this spoke volumes to Elizabeth. She knew it was too risky to demand a trial for herself, so she accepted her fate of being imprisoned inside of the castle her husband bought her. And now his wedding gift gesture does not seem so underwhelming. Little did he know that on the day they said I do, he was gifting Elizabeth the home where she would spend the remaining years of her life. In July of 1614, just a few years after that late December day when George stormed into her castle, some priests visited Elizabeth. They were there to see if she wanted to confess, which she did not. She said she was innocent, and the men left, writing that she was indeed confined in her castle, but quite able to move about as freely as she wanted to. The very next month, on August the 7th, Elizabeth turned 54 years old. Weeks later, on the evening of August the 20th of 1614, Elizabeth told her guard that her hands were cold. He told her not to worry about it, that it was nothing, and she should just go lie down. The next morning, servants noticed that Elizabeth's dinner was left untouched. They went to check on her and found their mistress in bed with her feet propped up on her pillow. Elizabeth Bathory died in her sleep after having been heard the night before praying and singing hymns to the Lord. She was barely 54 years old, and her family gathered, and Elizabeth was buried in the churchyard there on the grounds of her castle on November the 25th of 1614, which seems like a very long time to wait to bury a body, especially back then. But even so, the villagers protested, and probably the Lutheran priest, since they all seem to be anti Elizabeth. Her body was then exhumed and sent home to the castle in Etsch, where she was born, to be interred in the Bathory family crypt. This indicates to me that the family did not turn against her. If she was truly dead to them, I doubt they would have honored her with a proper burial. Sadly, though, there are no markings left to indicate where her body is buried, the physical woman disappearing while her story becomes a living, breathing legend. I say this because if I told you right now that Elizabeth died without ever standing trial for the crime she was accused of, and that's the end of the story, you would say, wait, what about how she bathed in the blood of virgins, or drank their blood like a vampire, or birthed werewolves? All lies, fake news, never happened. That's the part where this legend has taken on a life of its own and became something else entirely. And the worst part of that is that it was a priest who started most of the rumors. You see, after Elizabeth died, some locals obviously told stories and she would have become part of local folklore, especially after the rumor campaign was enacted in an attempt to make her alleged crimes become public knowledge. However, it was more than 150 years later when Elizabeth really hit the spotlight. A preacher man dug up some of her court records and decided to use her as a cautionary tale for his flock, embellishing all of the details because honestly, who is going to fact check a preacher? So he says all sorts of wild and outlandish things, tying Elizabeth to folkloric or mythological beliefs that weren't even really a thing back in her day, but things he wanted to scare his flock off from in his day. Then, many years later, another religious man takes Elizabeth's story even further, and he writes these scenes about her bathing in blood and attributes certain sayings to her, but it's all fiction. However, as we progress up through time, it's these stories that keep getting repeated and then get people like me digging in because I believe they are facts. And honestly, if I knew she never bathed in the blood of virgins, I probably would not have spent over a month of my life gathering all of this information. But then you see the lies and misrepresentations, and I feel obligated to bring you the truth and ruin my voice. These long episodes are so hard for me. I know you guys can hear my voice just breaking and cracking. I want to be clear. I am not saying that Elizabeth did not wrongly murder anyone because she most likely did. She probably used cruel and unusual punishments, especially by standards of the sane minded people amongst us today. However, I do believe most of the death came from epidemics and bad medical practices that everyone was using back then. There are records to indicate that the number of deaths on Elizabeth's estates spiked whenever a known plague was moving through the area. Additionally, people used to file complaints about everything from the most mundane offense you can think of. So the fact that there are zero recorded complaints against Elizabeth in any of the translated records that I could see prior to the death of her husband, and the fact that there were no grieving family members at the trial of the servant are things that give great pause on her guilt and heavy credence to the idea that she was made a spectacle simply because King Matthias was looking to remove power from the Bathory family line as a whole. Even the nobles who had complained about their daughters were only complaining that Elizabeth wouldn't give them the bodies. They were not accusing her of murder. The noble families rebelled against the Habsburg monarchy in 1697, and seemingly because of all of the things that had been happening from then all the way back to the late 1500s, which is pretty much the span of Elizabeth's lifetime. So make of that what you will. If we had time, I would go into some of the other things that happened after Elizabeth died and how her kids and grandchildren went on to accomplish some things that more or less prove that her trespasses did not impact the family name, which gives some more weight to maybe George being on their side, yet still playing the game of appeasing his king. There are theories that George was trying to claim land and titles for his son via the persecution of Elizabeth, but as everything she had went to her children and everything Francis had was already given to their son Paul before she was even arrested, and because none of the things speculated about actually ever came to pass, it's hard to say if any of those speculations are anything other than that, just speculation. I will only touch on one more item before we close this episode, and that's the matter of Elizabeth's supposed vanity, which is what led to the preachers claiming she slaughtered virgins to take their youthfulness. It is true that when describing certain aspects of Elizabeth's life, like the way she was known to change clothes several times a day, one could draw conclusions that she was rather high maintenance. However, changing clothing was a common part of noble life, and she was no more vain than the rest of them. Additionally, it is well documented that Elizabeth was hands on. She participated in goings on around her estate, primarily the healing practices, because remember, she was not only expected to have some level of common healing knowledge, but she had a fascination with science. In these types of activities alone, a person would find it reasonable to change their clothing often. Bathing was not so common back then either, so while the body could remain dirty, the clothing was expected to be kept clean, and because the body was dirty, the nobles used heavy perfumes, all of them, not only Elizabeth. Physical appearance was linked to health. In part one, I told you that Elizabeth was rumored to be a beautiful child, and this would have enticed Francis to easily accept her for his bride because physical beauty was a sign of strength and health. Nobles were most certainly preoccupied with ensuring that they continued to present as such, especially the females. So, this line of nobles being unduly vain comes up often, and reasonably so, considering the weight placed on the physical appearance of ladies. Elizabeth spending hours making sure she was perfectly presented was not uncommon for a lady of her status, nor was her rumored temper when it came to punishing the handmaids and seamstresses responsible for making sure every article of clothing fit her just right and every strand of hair was in its place. Elizabeth had always placed high standards on her personal appearance, and she did this in spite of not being someone who attended court. So you can see how her natural inclinations veered toward not only health and wellness, which seemed to preoccupy her thoughts, but how her family legacy surely impacted her to become the intelligent, well organized, not afraid to push boundaries, masculine energy female that she ultimately was. Elizabeth's actions were often aggressive. She took charge and had no problem doing so. In letters to vendors, she would tell them how much of something that she wanted, adding that they were to supply the amount requested, no more or no less. Whether this was off-putting to the men around her, who really knows? I'm sure some weak people, both male and female, would be offended by the very nature of someone like Elizabeth. However, I'm sure others appreciated that she would tell them what to do, when to do it, and exactly how she expected them to do it. That does not make her evil, and it does not make her innocent. I am firmly somewhere in the middle on this one. The conspiracy to remove her from power is clear enough, but the exact why is not. If I had to place money on something, I'd go with Matthias being paranoid that Elizabeth was going to side with Gabriel and help him to overthrow Matthias's rule. But Matthias could have also just really hated strong women or red dresses. He might have even put moves on Elizabeth and she turned him down. We don't know. I can only say that I do think George tried to help her in the small way that he could, and most of the smearing of her name, in my opinion, came long after her death, with these outlandish speculations about she must have been insane because her family was inbred, or she killed a virgin whose blood accidentally splashed onto her face. And afterward, Elizabeth realized she looked younger and how her handwriting was analyzed, and the expert claimed she was schizophrenic. The actual evidence, most through court records and letters sent to and from her, between her children, George, and so many other ledgers and accounts, does not show this evil, short tempered mass murderer. So I'm kind of disappointed because I don't think she deserves her Guinness World Record. As absolutely horrible as many of the described events were, I think Elizabeth's cruelty was on par for the time. I highly doubt she was the only noble female, or male for that matter, whose body count topped into double digits and possibly triple. Let me know what you think. It is definitely more fun to hear that she bathed in blood and had sadistic parties where people watched her kill and maim, and to believe that she was a sexual deviant who dominated those around her. But those attributes are not fact. Her guilt or innocence are not simple concepts, not when we look at her through the eyes of her own time and place, and not through our modern understanding and moralities. In 1618, 4 years after Elizabeth died, one of her female cousins was put on trial for witchcraft. The woman was tried again in 1621 and yet again in 1634. In my opinion, there was far less evidence against her cousin, but she was taken to trial nonetheless. And her story is an interesting one. If you guys want to hear it, let me know. If you would like me to pivot to aliens or angel encounters, let me know that too, because I have books on both of those topics sitting on my desk right now. And I also have one on some weird and mysterious history. I am open for pretty much anything, and I do read about as much as I listen to documentaries and even podcasts. So you name it, and I will do my best to shed a little candlelight. Also, feel free to just say hi, and even more free to send me some wins that have been happening in your life lately. My email is leadonabooks@gmail.com. I do not know when I will be back. I really need to finish this next manuscript before I do any more podcast research. So until I see you again, take care, be well, be kind, and hit all of those buttons for me. It doesn't matter where you're listening or watching. I'm seeing the views on Rumble start to build. So just like, subscribe, review, do all of the things that you do, and I will see you later. Bye.
Sunshine.